Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive into history. Tonight, we're uncovering a forgotten but resonant chapter of Viking life. Whether you're cozying up with a warm drink or already under the covers, thanks for letting me join you. Before we start, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Is the sun just rising, or are you, like me, surrounded by the quiet of night? I'm about to transport you back to medieval Scandinavia, a time when life was shockingly brief, violence was an everyday reality, and simply surviving winter was a huge accomplishment. We'll explore the harsh conditions that made the Viking Age one of the most challenging times to simply exist. Now, before we delve into this world of medieval hardship, here's something that might surprise you. I've spent the last 2 years sifting through primary sources, archaeological finds, and academic research on this period. I've read countless sagas, analyzed bone fragments from burial sites, and studied the remains of Viking settlements across Northern Europe. What I found was a world so brutal, so unforgiving, that it makes our modern problems seem trivial in comparison. But here's what makes this story even more compelling. Despite these impossible conditions, the Viking Age gave rise to some of the most remarkable achievements in human history. These people didn't just survive. They thrived, explored, and left a legacy that still shapes our world today. So, how did they do it? How did they manage to build a civilization in conditions that would break most of us in weeks? The answer lies in truly understanding just how brutal their world was. And that's exactly what we'll uncover together. By the end of this series, you'll see why the Viking Age wasn't just a time of epic adventures and legendary heroes. It was a period where merely staying alive demanded more courage than most of us will ever need to muster. Let's begin with something seemingly basic, yet utterly critical: food. In our modern world, we take year-round access to fresh groceries for granted. We grumble when our favorite restaurant is closed or delivery takes too long. But imagine if your next meal wasn't guaranteed. Imagine winter, meaning months of slow starvation, rationing whatever food you managed to preserve during the brief growing season. This was the grim reality for Viking Age communities. Scandinavia's growing season was incredibly short, perhaps just 4 months a year for crops to grow. The rest of the time, people relied on stored, preserved, or hunted provisions. And here is where it gets truly stark. Failing to prepare for winter didn't just mean discomfort, it meant death. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements is unsettling. Excavations of medieval garbage pits show people eating things we'd find absolutely repulsive today. We're talking every part of every animal, organs, bones ground into meal, even leather boiled for whatever scant nutrition it offered. When you find evidence of people eating bark and grass, desperation had set in. But the food shortage wasn't just about seasonal challenges. The Viking Age was a time of significant climate change. The medieval warm period, roughly 950 to 1250 CE, benefited some areas, but also brought unpredictable weather that could decimate entire harvests. A late frost, excessive rain, or drought could mean the difference between a community surviving winter or not. Speaking of weather, let's talk about what winter truly meant for these people. We're not talking about adjusting the thermostat or complaining about heating bills. We're talking about months of near constant darkness, temperatures that could kill you if you weren't properly clothed, and the very real possibility of running out of firewood before spring. The psychological toll of these winters was immense. Seasonal depression wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a survival threat. When you're already on the brink of starvation, the mental strain of months of darkness could push people over the edge. Saga literature is full of stories of people losing their minds during long winters, and archaeological evidence suggests that violence within communities often spiked during these dark periods. But here's what made it even more brutal. Even if you survived winter, spring brought its own deadly challenges. The spring thaw didn't just mean warmer weather. It meant floods that could destroy what little food remained. It meant diseases dormant in the cold months would suddenly erupt through communities. And it meant any structural damage to your home from the harsh winter now needed urgent repair, often when you were weakest from months of poor nutrition. You might be thinking, surely Vikings were tough enough to handle this. After all, these were the people who sailed the North Atlantic and reached North America centuries before Columbus. But here's the crucial point. The legendary Viking warriors we hear about were a tiny fraction of the population. Most people during the Viking Age were farmers, craftspeople, and their families simply trying to survive season to season. The average Viking Age farmer wasn't some mighty warrior with a battle axe. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary hardships, mothers trying to feed their children through winter, fathers desperately repairing homes before the next storm, and communities working together, knowing isolation meant death. This leads us to another brutal aspect of Viking Age life, the constant threat of violence. I'm not just talking about the famous Viking raids we see in movies. I'm talking about the everyday violence deeply embedded in medieval Scandinavian society. Blood feuds between families could last for generations, with violence erupting over matters that seem trivial to us today. The Viking Age legal system was based on wergold, essentially putting a price on human life. If someone killed your family member, you could demand payment or seek revenge. This created a cycle of violence that could tear communities apart. Sagas are filled with stories of feuds that began over minor disputes and escalated into multi-generational conflicts, devastating entire regions. But violence wasn't only external. Archaeological evidence shows that domestic violence was common, slavery was widespread, and the treatment of women and children could be shockingly brutal by modern standards. The romantic idea of Viking society as an egalitarian warrior culture falls apart when you examine the actual evidence of how people lived. Here's something that might surprise you. The average life expectancy during the Viking Age was between 35 and 40 years. But that number is misleading because it includes catastrophic infant mortality. If a child survived to age 5, they might live into their 50s or even 60s, but reaching age 5 was far from guaranteed. Infant mortality rates were so high that families often didn't even name their children until they were several years old. The emotional toll of losing child after child was something every family endured. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age cemeteries shows that roughly half of all children died before reaching adulthood. Imagine living in a world where half of all children don't make it to their teenage years. For those who did survive childhood, the challenges were far from over. Disease was a constant threat in a world without modern medicine. A simple cut could become infected and kill you. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for both mother and child. Dental problems could lead to fatal infections. What we consider minor health issues today were potential death sentences in the Viking Age. The archaeological record tells disturbing stories about health and disease. Skeletal remains show malnutrition, untreated injuries, and diseases that would have caused incredible suffering. We find evidence of people living with poorly healed broken bones, infections lasting years, and dental problems so severe that eating would have been agony. Perhaps most brutal of all was the constant uncertainty. In our modern world, we plan for the future, retirement, vacations. We assume tomorrow will be much like today, but in the Viking Age, the future was always uncertain. A raid could destroy your home and family. A harsh winter could wipe out your entire community. Disease could strike without warning and spread like wildfire. This uncertainty affected every aspect of life. People couldn't make long-term plans because they never knew what disasters might strike. They couldn't invest in home or farm improvements because raiders might destroy everything. They couldn't even assume their children would survive to adulthood. And yet, despite all these challenges, despite the constant threat of death and disaster, Viking Age people found ways to not just survive, but to create a rich and complex culture. They told stories that still captivate us, created art we still admire, and developed technologies ahead of their time. They explored and settled new lands with a courage that seems almost superhuman. This is what makes the Viking Age so fascinating. It wasn't just a time of barbarism and brutality. It was a time when humans faced impossible odds and found ways to overcome them. It was a time when communities united against adversity, when individuals showed incredible resilience, and when the human spirit refused to be broken by even the harshest conditions. But we're just getting started. What I've thus shown you is only the tip of the iceberg concerning the brutality of Viking Age life. We haven't even touched on the role of slavery, the terrifying reality of Viking raids for non-warriors, or the shocking treatment of the elderly and disabled. We haven't explored the brutal legal system, horrifying medical practices, or religious beliefs that shaped their understanding of suffering. We haven't discussed the role of women in this harsh world, the challenges of raising children when death lurked constantly, or the incredible physical demands of daily survival. And we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what it meant to be vulnerable in Viking Age society. Here's something that will truly shock you. If you were elderly, disabled, or simply unable to contribute to your community's survival, your life became expendable in ways that would horrify us today. Let me paint a picture of what happened when someone became too old or sick to work. In our modern world, we have social safety nets, retirement homes, and medical care for the elderly. We believe every human life has value, regardless of productivity. But in the Viking Age, resources were so scarce that communities made brutal calculations about who deserved to live and who didn't. Archaeological evidence reveals something deeply disturbing about how these societies dealt with their most vulnerable members. We find burial sites where elderly individuals show signs of having been deliberately abandoned or even killed when they could no longer contribute. Sagas, though often romanticized, mention practices we'd consider murder today. There's a chilling practice debated by historians as myth or reality called Titastep, literally family cliff. The very concept tells us something vital about how these societies viewed the burden of caring for non-productive members. The idea was that elderly family members would throw themselves off cliffs rather than consume resources needed by younger, more productive family members. But it wasn't just the elderly who faced this brutal reality. Children born with disabilities, women who couldn't bear children, men injured and unable to work all became liabilities in a world where every mouth to feed could mean the difference between community survival and extinction. Think about the decisions families faced: feeding an elderly parent or feeding your children, knowing there isn't enough for everyone. Imagine abandoning a disabled child because caring for them would jeopardize your entire family. These weren't abstract moral dilemmas. They were daily realities that tore families apart and left lasting psychological scars. The Viking Age legal system mirrored this brutal pragmatism. Laws existed that made it legal to abandon or kill family members who became burdens. Utlager or outlawry could apply not just to criminals, but to anyone deemed a threat to community survival. Being declared an outlaw meant losing all legal rights, cut off from human contact, left to die alone in the wilderness. Even more disturbing, Viking Age religious beliefs often supported these practices. The Norse concept of fate, or word, suggested that suffering was predetermined and unavoidable. This fatalistic worldview made it easier to accept the abandonment of vulnerable community members as simply part of the natural order. Let us talk about something that might be even more brutal than the treatment of the vulnerable: the reality of Viking raids for ordinary people. We've all heard stories of Viking warriors sailing to raid and pillage. but we rarely hear about being on the receiving end or how raiding culture affected Viking society itself. For targeted farmers and villagers, the experience was pure terror. These weren't organized military campaigns with rules of engagement. They were surprise attacks designed to steal everything valuable and kill or enslave anyone who resisted. Archaeological evidence from raided settlements shows the aftermath: burned buildings, hastily buried treasures, and mass graves filled with victims of Viking violence. What's particularly horrifying is that raids weren't just about treasure. They were about capturing slaves. The Viking Age economy relied heavily on slavery to a degree that would shock most people today. Slaves, called thralls, made up as much as 25% of the population in some Viking communities. These weren't prisoners of war who might be ransomed. They were human property, thought and sold like livestock. The treatment of slaves was beyond brutal. They had no legal rights, could be killed, tortured, or sexually abused with no consequences for their owners. Archaeological evidence suggests slaves were often sacrificed during religious ceremonies or buried alive with their deceased masters. The very existence of slavery on this scale reveals something disturbing about how Viking society viewed human life and dignity. The psychological impact of living in a society where slavery was normal affected everyone, not just the thralls. Children grew up seeing humans treated as property. Women lived with constant fear of capture and enslavement. Men knew failure in battle could mean not just death, but enslavement for their families. Even within Viking communities, among free people, the threat of violence was constant. The honor culture meant perceived slights could escalate into deadly conflicts. A man who didn't violently respond to an insult was a coward, and cowardice was worse than death. This created a vicious cycle where violence bred more violence. Young men were expected to prove their worth through combat, ensuring each generation produced new warriors seeking to establish reputations through bloodshed. Sagas are full of men dying for honor over trivial matters, leaving their families vulnerable and destitute. The legal system tried to manage this violence with codes of conduct and compensation, but these systems often failed under competing honor claims. Blood feuds could last generations, each act of revenge sparking new cycles of violence, tearing communities apart, leaving everyone poorer and more vulnerable. And speaking of vulnerability, let's discuss what it meant to be a woman in Viking Age society. While popular culture sometimes portrays Viking women as fierce shield maidens, the reality was far more complex and often brutal. Most women had few rights and were considered property of their fathers, husbands, or male relatives. They could be married off without consent, often as children. They had no legal standing in most matters and could be divorced or abandoned by their husbands at will. Archaeological evidence suggests domestic violence was common and accepted. Perhaps most horrifying was the reality of childbirth. Without modern medicine or sterile conditions, giving birth was incredibly dangerous. Maternal mortality rates were staggering. Some estimates suggest as many as 1 in 4 women died in childbirth. For those who survived, the physical and emotional toll was enormous. Women were expected to have as many children as possible due to high infant mortality, meaning they spent most of their adult lives pregnant or nursing, often malnourished and overworked. This constant cycle of pregnancy, birth, and infant death created a level of psychological trauma we can barely imagine. If a woman couldn't have children or repeatedly lost them, she might be divorced or abandoned. Fertility was a woman's primary value, and those who couldn't reproduce were often seen as failures. This put immense pressure on women to keep having children, even when their bodies were failing. The archaeological record tells disturbing stories about women's lives, evidence of women dying from complications of multiple pregnancies, buried with signs of domestic violence, or sacrificed or murdered when their husbands died. Even women who survived childbirth and raised children faced constant challenges. They were responsible for food preparation and preservation, meaning their family's winter survival depended on their skills. They managed households with limited resources, cared for sick family members without medical knowledge, and protected their children from constant threats of disease, violence, and starvation. You might wonder how anyone maintained hope or joy in such a brutal world. The answer lies in their fundamentally different mindset. Viking Age people didn't expect life to be fair or comfortable. They didn't assume they deserved happiness or that suffering was meaningless. Instead, they developed a worldview glorifying endurance and courage in the face of impossible odds. The concept of drengerskap, roughly honor or manliness, wasn't just about fighting prowess. It was about facing hardship with dignity, accepting fate without complaint, and remaining loyal to family and community, even if it meant personal sacrifice. This mindset helped people cope with conditions that would break most of us today. When you expect life to be brutal, when you're raised to believe suffering is inevitable, when your culture celebrates those who endure hardship without complaint, you develop a psychological resilience that's hard for us to grasp. But this resilience came at a cost. The emotional numbness required to survive in such a harsh world often meant people became disconnected from their own feelings and others. The acceptance of brutality as normal led to a society where violence was not just common but celebrated. This brings us to one of the most disturbing aspects of Viking Age life, the normalization of cruelty. When survival depends on being harder and more ruthless than your enemies, compassion becomes a luxury few can afford. When resources are so scarce that showing mercy might mean your own family's death, empathy becomes a dangerous weakness. This created a society where incredible acts of cruelty were not just accepted but expected. Sagas are filled with stories of torture, mutilation, and revenge that we'd consider war crimes today. But these weren't aberrations. They were seen as necessary to maintain honor and deter enemies. The psychological impact of living in such a world affected everyone. Children grew up witnessing violence and cruelty as normal parts of life. They learned the world was a dangerous place where only the strong survived, and that showing weakness or compassion could be fatal. This created generations psychologically adapted to brutality, but often incapable of the emotional intimacy and vulnerability we consider essential to human happiness. Perhaps most disturbing of all was how this brutality affected relationships between people who should have been able to trust each other. In a world where anyone might become an enemy, where resources were so scarce that even family members might compete for survival, genuine trust became almost impossible. Marriages were often strategic alliances rather than love matches. Friendships were complicated by the constant possibility of betrayal. Even parent-child relationships were affected by the knowledge that resources were limited and difficult. Choices might have to be made about who survived. This lack of trust extended into every aspect of daily life. Archaeological evidence from Viking Age settlements reveals something fascinating and disturbing. Homes were built like fortresses, even within communities. Thick walls, narrow windows, and heavy doors weren't just protection against foreign raiders. They were protection against neighbors who might turn violent over a land dispute, a perceived insult, or sheer desperation during a harsh winter. The psychological toll of this constant vigilance was immense. Imagine never being able to fully relax, never being able to trust completely, always having to calculate whether the person across from you might become a threat. This wasn't paranoia, it was survival. Sagas recount countless betrayals between supposed allies, friends turning on each other over trivial matters, and communities tearing themselves apart from within. Even more disturbing, consider the children. In our modern world, we try to shield children from violence, giving them security and innocence. But in the Viking Age, Children were exposed to brutality from their earliest years because sheltering them would have left them unprepared for the harsh realities of adulthood. Children as young as 5 or 6 were expected to help with dangerous tasks like hunting, farming, and even warfare. They witnessed executions, participated in religious sacrifices, and learned to accept violence as a normal part of life. Archaeological evidence shows children often buried with weapons, suggesting even young people were expected to be ready for combat. The educational system, if you can call it that, aimed to create survivors, not well-rounded individuals. Children learned practical skills for survival: how to fight, preserve food, read weather patterns, identify edible plants. But they also learned psychological skills we'd consider unhealthy today: how to suppress empathy, endure pain without complaint, and make brutal decisions without hesitation. This leads to perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Viking Age life: the complete absence of what we would recognize as childhood. There was no concept of protecting children from adult responsibilities or realities. As soon as a child was physically capable of contributing to family survival, they were expected to. As soon as they were old enough to grasp life's harsh realities, they were plunged into them completely. Children often made decisions that would traumatize adults today, choosing which sibling got the last food portion during a famine, helping abandon elderly relatives who became burdens, or participating in violence against neighbors. These weren't exceptional circumstances. They were normal parts of growing up. The psychological development of children in this environment was completely different from what we consider healthy. They learned to compartmentalize trauma, suppress emotional responses seen as weakness, and accept suffering as inevitable. This created adults who were incredibly resilient, but often emotionally stunted in ways that affected their relationships and ability to find joy. Let us delve into something even more disturbing: the role of religion in justifying and perpetuating this brutality. The Norse religious system wasn't just about worshiping gods. It was about maintaining a worldview that made sense of constant suffering and violence. The Norse concept of fate, or word, suggested everything was predetermined and unavoidable. This wasn't abstract philosophy. It was a practical tool for coping with trauma and loss. When your child died of disease, your farm was destroyed by raiders, or your family was torn apart by violence, you could tell yourself it was all part of fate's plan. But this fatalistic worldview also made it easier to justify cruelty and violence. If everything was predetermined, why try to prevent suffering or injustice? If the gods decided someone should die, then killing them was fulfilling divine will. This created a religious framework that not only accepted brutality but encouraged it. The Norse gods themselves were violent, capricious beings who rewarded strength and punished weakness. Odin, the chief god, was known for breaking oaths, betraying allies, and using deception. Thor was celebrated for his violent rages and willingness to use force. These weren't moral exemplars. They were divine endorsements of the behavior necessary for survival in a brutal world. Religious ceremonies often involved violence and sacrifice. Archaeological evidence shows human sacrifice was common during important festivals, often involving prolonged torture. Victims were sometimes volunteers believing their deaths benefited their communities, but often they were slaves or prisoners with no choice. The religious calendar revolved around the harsh realities of survival. Winter solstice celebrations weren't just about the longest night. They were about praying for survival through deadly months. Spring festivals weren't just about new growth. They were about thanking the gods for surviving winter and asking for protection during the dangerous months of raiding and warfare ahead. What is particularly disturbing about Viking Age religion is that it actively discouraged the compassion and mercy that might have made life more bearable. The concept of neath, roughly shame or dishonor, stigmatized anyone who showed what we'd consider basic human decency. Helping the weak, showing mercy to enemies, or avoiding violence were all seen as shameful acts that dishonored individuals and their families. This created a society where people were actually afraid to be kind, afraid to show compassion, afraid to help those suffering. The religious and social systems worked together to create a culture of cruelty far beyond what was necessary for survival. Now, let us discuss something that truly reveals Viking Age society as brutality: the treatment of the mentally ill. In our modern world, we recognize mental illness as a medical condition deserving treatment and compassion. But in the Viking Age, mental illness was seen as divine punishment or demonic possession, and treatments were often more horrifying than the conditions themselves. Archaeological evidence and sagas reveal that people with mental illness were often chained, beaten, or abandoned. They were seen as threats to community safety and treated accordingly. The concept of berserkers, famous warriors fighting in trance-like states, might have been a way of weaponizing mental illness, turning psychologically disordered people into living weapons. Even more disturbing, mental illness was often seen as contagious. Families with a mentally ill member were often ostracized, forced to choose between abandoning their afflicted relative or facing exile themselves. This created impossible situations where families had to choose between compassion and survival. Treatment methods for mental illness were based on the belief that evil spirits or divine displeasure caused the condition. This meant treatments often involved physical torture, starvation, or exposure to extreme conditions. The goal wasn't to heal the person, but to drive out the evil forces believed to be causing the condition. Many people died from these treatments, but their deaths were seen as evidence that the evil had been successfully driven out, not as treatment failures. The concept of mental illness as a medical condition deserving treatment and compassion was completely foreign. Instead, it was seen as a moral failing, a sign of weakness, or evidence of supernatural corruption. This created a society where psychologically traumatized people were not only denied help, but actively persecuted and punished. The psychological impact of living in a society where mental illness was stigmatized and punished affected everyone. People learned to hide their emotional struggles, suppress their psychological pain, and pretend they were unaffected by the constant trauma and violence. This created a society where authentic emotional expression was dangerous and psychological healing impossible. But the treatment of disabled individuals also reveals something important about the Viking Age: economy and social structure. In a world where every person had to contribute to community survival, anyone who couldn't work was seen as a drain on limited resources. This wasn't just practical necessity. It was a fundamental worldview that saw human worth as entirely dependent on productive capacity. This utilitarian approach to human life created a society where people constantly proved their worth through their ability to contribute. The fear of becoming disabled, a burden, or unproductive haunted everyone. People pushed themselves to work even when injured or sick, often worsening their conditions, because they knew showing weakness could mean abandonment or death. The religious system reinforced these attitudes by teaching that disability was punishment for wrongdoing, either by the individual or their ancestors. This created a worldview where disabled people were not just burdens, but deserving of their suffering. The idea that they might deserve compassion or care was seen as interfering with divine justice. Let us examine another aspect of Viking Age brutality that reveals the true horror of daily existence: the reality of food scarcity and the desperate measures people took to survive famines. We've touched on this, but the full extent of starvation in Viking society is almost incomprehensible from our modern perspective. Archaeological evidence reveals that severe food shortages were not rare but regular features of Viking Age life. Climate data shows frequent crop failures, sometimes for several years running. During these periods, communities made decisions about who would eat and who would starve that reveal their world is true brutality. Evidence from these famine periods is deeply disturbing. We find human remains showing signs of cannibalism, suggesting people were driven to eat their own dead rather than starve. We find evidence of infanticide during famine years, where families killed their youngest children to preserve food for older, more productive members. We find burial sites where entire families died together, apparently choosing death over the horror of deciding which family members would survive. But perhaps most horrifying is how these famines affected social relationships. Archaeological sites reveal that during severe food shortages, communities sometimes turned on their weakest members, driving them away or killing them to preserve resources for the strong. The elderly, disabled, and sick were often the first to be abandoned. The psychological impact of living through these famines was devastating. Survivors lived with the knowledge that they had watched loved ones die, made impossible choices about who deserved to live, and might have to make those choices again. This created a society where human relationships were always provisional, where love was tempered by the knowledge that survival might require abandoning those you cared about. The methods people used to survive famines reveal the desperation. Archaeological evidence shows people ate things we'd consider inedible: leather, bark, grass, even dirt mixed with whatever organic matter they could find. They boiled bones repeatedly to extract every possible bit of nutrition and ate the bones themselves when nothing else was available. The physical effects of chronic malnutrition were severe and long-lasting. Skeletal remains show stunted growth, dental problems, and bone diseases caused by poor nutrition. These effects weren't temporary. They affected people for their entire lives, making them more susceptible to disease and injury. But the psychological effects of chronic hunger were perhaps even more devastating. People who lived through repeated famines developed what we now recognize as trauma symptoms: hypervigilance about food, hoarding, and an inability to trust that resources would be available. These adaptations helped people survive famines, but also made it impossible for them to enjoy periods of abundance. The social effects of chronic food scarcity were equally profound. Communities that experienced severe famines often became more violent and competitive, as people learned that cooperation and sharing could be fatal when resources were extremely limited. Trust between community members eroded. The religious system incorporated these harsh realities by teaching that suffering was inevitable and that the gods rewarded those who endured hardship without complaint. This worldview saw famine not as a tragedy to be prevented, but as a test of character to be endured. The idea that communities should work together to prevent or mitigate famines was foreign to a society that saw suffering as a natural and necessary part of life. Let us talk about something even more disturbing than the famines themselves: how the constant threat of starvation affected how people thought about food and eating. In our modern world, food is associated with pleasure, celebration, and social bonding. We eat together, celebrate with meals, and express love through food. But in the Viking Age, food was primarily associated with survival, competition, and anxiety. Meals weren't social occasions. They were opportunities to consume as much nutrition as possible before it was gone. The constant fear of future scarcity made it impossible to enjoy eating, even when food was relatively abundant. The psychological impact of this relationship with food affected every aspect of daily life. People couldn't relax and enjoy meals because they were constantly calculating how much food was left, how long it would last, and whether they were eating too much. This transformed one of the most basic human pleasures into a source of constant stress and anxiety. The social rituals around food reflect this harsh reality. Archaeological evidence suggests meals were often silent affairs. people focusing entirely on eating rather than socializing. Communal feasting, described in some sagas, was likely reserved for special occasions of unusual abundance. And even then, it was probably tinged with the knowledge that such abundance was temporary. The distribution of food within families and communities reveals the brutal hierarchies. The best food was reserved for the most productive members, while children, the elderly, and the disabled received leftovers. This wasn't just practical necessity. It was a social system reinforcing the idea that some people were more valuable than others. The psychological impact of this food hierarchy on children was particularly devastating. They learned early that food access depended on their perceived value, creating immense pressure to prove their worth, demonstrate they deserved to eat, and accept that survival was conditional on contribution. Food scarcity also affected how people thought about the future and their ability to plan. In our modern world, we assume food will be available, allowing us to make long-term plans and invest in future goals. But in the Viking Age, the constant threat of famine made long-term planning almost impossible. This inability to plan had profound effects. People couldn't nest in farm or community improvements because they never knew if they'd survive the next winter. They couldn't develop specialized skills because they might need to focus all energy on basic survival. They couldn't build institutions or systems for future generations because they weren't sure future generations would exist. The archaeological record reveals the tragic consequences. Communities trying to develop sophisticated agricultural techniques or craft specializations, but these developments were almost always cut short by famines, raids, or other disasters. This pattern of interrupted development trapped society in a cycle of surviving crisis to crisis, never building stability and prosperity. Perhaps most tragically, the constant threat of starvation affected human relationships and the ability to form deep emotional connections. In our modern world, sharing food is a basic way we show love and care. But in the Viking Age, sharing food was often dangerous, threatening your own survival. The natural human impulse to care for others through food was constantly at war with the practical necessity of preserving resources for yourself and your most essential family members. This transformed one of the most basic expressions of human love into a potential threat to survival. The psychological impact was profound. People learned to suppress their natural generosity, harden their hearts against others' suffering, and see sharing as a weakness that could be fatal. This created a society where human relationships were always tinged with calculation, where love was always tempered by the knowledge that caring too much could be dangerous. The archaeological evidence reveals how this affected family relationships, food carefully rationed even between parents, and children, meals eaten in silence to avoid conflict over portions, and family members forced to compete for survival. Natural family bonds were strained by constant scarcity. The impact extended beyond individual families to entire communities. Social bonds were constantly tested by resource allocation decisions during shortages. Communities that had lived peacefully for generations could be torn apart by famines, forcing choices between members. The legal and social systems were designed around the assumption of constant scarcity and difficult choices. Laws made it legal to abandon or exile community members seen as burdens during shortages. Social customs reinforced the idea that individual survival was less important than community survival. Here's what is even more tragic. Archaeological evidence suggests many devastating famines could have been prevented or mitigated with better planning, cooperation, and resource management. Communities that worked together to store food, share resources, and support vulnerable members often survive shortages that destroyed more competitive communities. This suggests that the brutality of Viking Age life wasn't entirely inevitable. It was partly the result of social and cultural choices that prioritized individual survival over collective welfare. The same intelligence and creativity that helped Vikings survive harsh conditions could have been used to create more sustainable and humane communities. But the psychological adaptations to extreme scarcity made it difficult to imagine or implement alternatives. The mindset that saw sharing as dangerous, cooperation as weakness, and compassion as a luxury became so deeply embedded that it persisted, even when conditions might have allowed for more humane approaches. The legacy of these psychological adaptations extended far beyond the Viking Age. Cultural patterns developed in response to extreme scarcity emphasis on individual survival. Acceptance of inequality, suppression of empathy became embedded in traditions, affecting how people thought about themselves and others for centuries. But understanding the full extent of food scarcity in Viking society also helps us appreciate the progress human civilization has made in creating more secure and sustainable food systems. The abundance we take for granted today isn't just a result of technological advancement. It is also the result of social and cultural changes that have made cooperation and sharing possible on a scale unimaginable in the Viking Age. The story of food scarcity in Viking society is ultimately about human resilience and the costs of survival under extreme conditions. It shows us what happens when people are forced to make impossible choices, when natural human compassion conflicts with practical necessity, and when the basic requirements of survival transform the most fundamental aspects of human relationships. But it also shows us that even under the most brutal conditions, people found ways to maintain their humanity, care for others when possible, and create meaning and beauty in their lives. The archaeological record reveals not just suffering and scarcity, but also evidence of people who shared what little they had, cared for the vulnerable when they could, and found ways to celebrate life even amidst constant hardship. This resilience in the face of impossible odds is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the Viking Age. It shows us that humans are capable of enduring almost anything that the human spirit can survive, even the most brutal conditions, and that people can find ways to create hope and meaning, even when their world seems designed to crush both. Understanding this history helps us appreciate not just how far we've come, but also how much courage and wisdom it has taken to create societies where basic human needs can be met, where compassion is possible, and where people can plan for the future with some confidence that their efforts will not be in vain. The Viking Age shows us both the worst and the best of human nature, the capacity for incredible cruelty and the capacity for incredible resilience. It shows us what happens when societies are pushed to their absolute limits and the price people pay when survival becomes the only goal. But most importantly, it shows us that the progress we then made in creating more humane and sustainable societies is not inevitable or permanent. The same conditions that created the brutality of the Viking Age could emerge again if we were not careful to protect and nurture the social and cultural achievements that make compassion and cooperation possible. The lessons of the Viking Age are not just historical curiosities. They're warnings about what can happen when societies break down, resources become scarce, and people are forced to choose between their humanity and their survival. Understanding these lessons helps us appreciate what we have, protect what we've achieved, and work to create a world where such impossible choices never have to be made again. The psychological scars left by this constant struggle for survival created patterns of behavior almost incomprehensible to us today. Imagine living in a world where every act of kindness could be interpreted as weakness, where showing mercy to an enemy might be seen as betraying your own community, where the very emotions that make us human had to be suppressed because they could get you killed. This emotional suppression wasn't just individual. It was systematic, woven into the very fabric of how children were raised and how communities functioned. Viking Age parents didn't have the luxury of protecting their children's innocence. Instead, they had to prepare them for a world where survival depended on being harder, more ruthless, and more emotionally detached than their enemies. The archaeological evidence reveals how this played out daily. Children's graves show young bodies with signs of violence, suggesting even children were expected to participate in their world's brutal realities. Toys were often miniature weapons designed to teach combat rather than play. Burial sites show families choosing to die together rather than face the horror of watching their children grow up in such a harsh world. Here's what's even more disturbing. The children who survived this upbringing often became adults incapable of the emotional intimacy we consider essential to human happiness. They learned to see vulnerability as dangerous, love as weakness, and compassion as a luxury that could cost them their lives. This created generations of people who were incredibly tough, but also incredibly isolated, surrounded by others, yet fundamentally alone. The impact of this emotional isolation on Viking society was profound. Communities lived side by side but never truly trusted each other. Families were held together by practical necessity rather than emotional bonds. Friendships were temporary alliances. The kind of deep human connections that give life meaning were seen as dangerous vulnerabilities. This psychological adaptation to brutality also affected how people understood their own suffering. In our modern world, suffering is something to be minimized, pain deserves help, and emotional healing is important. But in the Viking Age, suffering was seen as inevitable, character building, and even divinely ordained. The religious system reinforced this acceptance, teaching that pain was punishment or a test. This worldview saw seeking help for emotional pain as weakness, complaining about suffering as failure, and psychological healing as self-indulgence. The sagas and epic poems reveal how deeply this acceptance of suffering penetrated Viking consciousness. These stories don't just describe brutal events. They celebrate them, glorifying characters who endure incredible pain without complaint, sacrifice everything for honor, and choose death over shameful compromise. These weren't just entertainment. They were instruction manuals for how to live in a world where brutality was normal. Let us talk about something that reveals even more about the psychological toll: the complete absence of what we would consider privacy or personal space. In our modern world, we take for granted retreating to our own rooms, having private conversations, processing emotions without constant observation. But in the Viking Age, privacy was a luxury few could afford. Most people lived in single-room dwellings with their extended families, where every conversation was overheard, every emotion visible, and every moment shared. The psychological pressure of never being alone, never expressing vulnerability without witnesses, never processing trauma in private was enormous. Archaeological evidence reveals how this lack of privacy affected mental health. People carved small hiding places in their homes for moments of solitude. They walked long distances from communities, seeking solitude impossible at home. Some chose to live as hermits, abandoning communities entirely. The absence of privacy meant mental illness, emotional breakdown, and psychological trauma were always public spectacles. Struggling people couldn't hide their suffering, creating immense pressure to maintain a facade of strength even when falling apart. The social consequences were profound. Communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, personal struggles became public, and any sign of weakness could be exploited. People learned to hide true feelings, present facades of strength, and suppress natural responses to trauma. Lack of privacy also affected relationships and emotional processing. In our modern world, we talk to trusted friends or family privately. But in the Viking Age, such conversations were nearly impossible. People largely processed trauma and emotions alone, without the social support we consider essential. The psychological impact of this isolation was devastating. People had no safe space to process emotions, no confidants, no privacy to grieve. This created a society where psychological healing was nearly impossible, where trauma accumulated and people often broke down under unexpressed emotion. The religious system offered some emotional outlet, but it was limited and often dangerous. Ceremonies provided socially acceptable ways to express grief, anger, or fear, but required conforming to specific cultural expectations. People who grieved too much, showed too much fear, or expressed emotions inappropriately could face ostracism or worse. Absence of privacy also affected identity and self-worth. In our modern world, we develop self-sense through private reflection. But in the Viking Age, private reflection was nearly impossible. Identities were largely determined by public roles, social status, and conformity to community expectations. This lack of private space for self-reflection created psychological impoverishment, where people had little understanding of their inner lives. They knew their public roles, obligations, and expectations, but had little opportunity to explore their own thoughts, feelings, and desires. This impacted every aspect of human relationships. Romantic relationships were conducted under constant observation, making intimacy difficult. Parent-child relationships were shaped by public interaction, making it hard to show vulnerability or express true feelings. Friendships were limited by the knowledge that every conversation could be overheard. Perhaps most tragically, the absence of privacy meant no safe space to dream, imagine alternatives, or envision better possibilities. The kind of private reflection leading to innovation and progress was nearly impossible. The psychological toll of living under constant observation was enormous. People developed symptoms of chronic stress, hypervigilance, emotional numbing, inability to relax or feel safe. These were permanent psychological adaptations. Archaeological evidence reveals physical effects of this stress, damage to bones and teeth from constant tension, people dying young from stress-related illnesses. But lack of privacy also reveals something important about Viking community. While we see communities as supportive, in the Viking Age, they were often sources of stress and surveillance. People lived in close proximity, not by choice, but by necessity, and the intimacy created was often uncomfortable and oppressive. Social bonds were based more on mutual surveillance and control than genuine affection or shared values. People watched each other constantly, not out of care, but suspicion. This created communities held together by fear and obligation, not love. The psychological impact was learning to see others as threats, developing defensive mechanisms preventing exploitation, but also preventing deep connections. They learned to be suspicious of kindness, interpret generosity as manipulation, and see vulnerability as exploitable weakness. Let us examine another aspect of Viking Age brutality, the reality of what it meant to be a child in this harsh world. Children weren't just exposed to violence and hardship. They were systematically traumatized as part of their education. The process of turning children into adults who could survive required breaking down their natural compassion, innate trust, and childlike wonder. Archaeological evidence reveals how the systematic traumatization affected development. Children were forced to participate in violent rituals, witness executions and torture, and expected to show no emotional response. Burial sites show children interred with weapons, suggesting even young people were expected to be ready for violence. Perhaps most disturbing is how children were used as tools of war and intimidation. Archaeological sites reveal children sometimes forced to participate in raids, not as warriors, but as psychological weapons to demoralize enemies. The sight of children engaging in violence was apparently so shocking it could break adult defenders' will. The psychological impact of this systematic traumatization on children was devastating. They learned early that the world was dangerous, only the strong survived, weakness was fatal, and violence was not only acceptable, but necessary. This created adults who were incredibly resilient, but also incredibly damaged, capable of enduring almost anything, but incapable of experiencing the joy and wonder that makes life worth living. The educational system aimed to create survivors, not whole human beings. Children learned practical skills like fighting, hunting, and crafts. But they also learned psychological skills we'd consider deeply unhealthy: how to suppress empathy, inflict pain without guilt, and make brutal decisions without hesitation. The absence of what we would consider childhood play is particularly revealing. Archaeological sites from the Viking Age contain almost no evidence of toys, games, or other artifacts associated with childhood enjoyment. Instead, we find miniature weapons, practice tools, and other objects designed to prepare children for adult responsibilities. This suggests the concept of childhood as a time of innocence and play was completely foreign. The psychological development of children in this environment was fundamentally different. They learned to compartmentalize trauma, suppress emotional responses seen as weakness, and accept suffering as inevitable. This created adults who were incredibly tough but emotionally stunted, capable of enduring incredible hardship, but not the full range of human emotions. The impact of this childhood trauma on adult relationships was profound. Systematically traumatized children often had difficulty forming intimate relationships, trusting others, or expressing vulnerability. They had learned that emotional openness was dangerous. Caring too much could be fatal, and the safest approach was emotional distance. But the systematic traumatization of children also reveals how Viking society understood human nature. They believed children were naturally weak and needed to be hardened through exposure to brutality. The idea that children might naturally develop into compassionate, empathetic adults was seen as naive and dangerous. Instead, they believed creating functional adults required deliberately breaking down children's natural tendencies toward kindness and trust. This created a cycle of trauma almost impossible to break. Adults traumatized as children became parents who traumatized their own, believing they were preparing them for harsh realities. Each generation passed on psychological damage, creating a culture where trauma was not just common, but expected. The religious system reinforced this cycle by teaching that suffering was character building, hardship divinely ordained, and people who hadn't endured trauma were somehow inferior. This worldview saw traumatizing children not as abuse, but necessary preparation for adulthood. Archaeological evidence reveals how this cycle of trauma affected entire communities. Violence was so common it was apparently normal. Children grew up surrounded by evidence of brutality, and trauma was so pervasive it shaped every aspect of daily life. Perhaps most tragically, the systematic traumatization of children meant entire generations grew up without ever experiencing the love, safety, and nurturing we consider essential for healthy development. They learned to survive but never thrived. They learned to endure but never enjoy. They learned to exist but never truly live. The psychological impact of this deprivation extended far beyond individual suffering. It created a society where the full potential of human creativity, compassion, and intelligence was never realized. Children who might have become artists, healers, or innovators were instead shaped into warriors, survivors, and competitors. The loss of human potential was staggering, representing not just individual tragedies, but a collective impoverishment of human possibility. The legacy of this systematic childhood trauma extended far beyond the Viking Age. Psychological patterns developed in response to early traumatization became embedded in cultural traditions, affecting how people raised children for centuries. The belief that children needed to be hardened by brutality, that kindness was weakness, and that survival required suppressing natural human compassion became part of the cultural DNA, shaping child rearing for generations. But understanding the full extent of childhood trauma in Viking society also helps U.S. appreciate the progress human civilization has made in understanding child development and protecting children from unnecessary suffering. The recognition that children need love, safety, and nurturing to develop into healthy adults isn't just a modern luxury. It's a fundamental insight into human nature that has taken centuries to develop and implement. The story of childhood in the Viking Age is ultimately about the costs of survival under extreme conditions. It shows us what happens when societies are so focused on creating survivors that they forget to create human beings. When survival requirements become so demanding, they destroy the very humanity they're meant to preserve. But it also shows us the incredible resilience of children and the human capacity to endure even the most brutal conditions. The archaeological evidence reveals not just trauma and suffering, but also children who found ways to maintain their humanity despite everything, who created small moments of joy and wonder, and who grew into adults, capable of love and compassion despite traumatic upbringings. This resilience in the face of systematic trauma is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of human nature revealed by the Viking Age. It shows us that even under the most brutal conditions, even when societies seem designed to crush the human spirit, people find ways to maintain their essential humanity. This gives us hope that no matter how dark the world becomes, no matter how brutal the conditions, the human capacity for love, creativity, and compassion will always find a way to survive. The lessons of childhood trauma in the Viking Age are not just historical curiosities. They reminders of what can happen when societies lose sight of protecting and nurturing their most vulnerable members. Understanding these lessons helps us appreciate the progress we've made, protect our achievements, and work to create a world where no child has to endure such systematic brutalization in the name of preparation for life.